What's up YouTube? Cody Bidlow with SprintingWorkouts.com. Today we're going to be talking about sprint technique, biomechanics, and give you kind of a fundamental baseline idea of what the important things are that you need to focus on when it comes to sprinting technique. Because biomechanics and sprinting technique play a pivotal role in whether you stay healthy and run faster or stay injured and run slow, it's important that we have a fundamental GED level of understanding of what to look for when analyzing the sprint form of yourself or your athletes. Today we're going to cover some big ticket items which I think are of significant importance for all athletes, really. The information shared here is information I've gathered over time by learning from my mentors such as Dan Paff, watching film of sprinters from developmental levels up to elite performers, studying sprinting related research, and in my own personal experience as an athlete and as a coach. Some of the things I say may be debated by others, but overall the qualities discussed here are commonalities that can be seen in many athletes of varied skill levels. And because you can see these qualities in all these different athletes, that's the type of thing that you want to look for. Not just the thing that one top performer does, but what are the commonalities and the common themes that we see when we look at the technique of athletes of various skill levels. In no particular order, this is what we're going to cover today. Posture and axis behavior, rhythm and frequency progressions, direction of force application, center of mass elevation, limb symmetry, ground contact qualities, flight and ground contact time progression, and injury patterns and compensation patterns. Understand that many of these categories and topics are interrelated, and they shouldn't be looked at in silos, but instead consider these categories and these specific items themselves, as well as how they may interrelate with one another. If after ingesting the following information you feel that you need some extra help with analyzing your sprinting technique, make sure to check out my technical analysis service on SprintingWorkouts.com. There you can send me video, I'll take a look at it, give you some ideas of what you can work on, and hopefully help you out. First up, we got posture and body axis behavior. When analyzing sprint technique, the first menu item I look toward is body positioning, body posture, and how the different axes of the body move and interact. Posture can be defined as the overall positioning of the body with a specific focus on the positioning and orientation of the spine and the pelvis. Our limb actions are limited by the actions of the spine and pelvis, and therefore these are the areas we want to look toward first when analyzing sprint technique. There are different axes of the body, which is the plural of the word axis, such as the longitudinal axis of the spine, the transverse axis of the shoulders and hips, and the longitudinal axis of the foot, just to name a few. Now, as we progress from a stationary position and we begin to sprint, the longitudinal axis of the spine will rotate vertically each step until upright sprinting is achieved. If you're analyzing someone's sprint technique, the first thing to look for is whether or not they are exhibiting this progression from a more forward-oriented body position to an upright body position at the end of acceleration. When we stay too low and do not raise our posture as we accelerate, we can reduce the space available between us and the ground to cycle our limbs through to the next stride. This leads to poor quality ground contacts and raises the risk of injury. Another aspect to pay attention with posture is the movement of the shoulder and hip axis during sprinting. The shoulder and hip axis will undulate and oscillate each step in a harmonious manner, counterbalancing one another. So as you are pushing off the ground, one hip is going to rise and then that shoulder is going to drop. Also, that hip is going to push forward and that shoulder might push back. Say you're watching someone from the side while they sprint. As their arm swing comes up and forward, that shoulder is going to come forward and the other shoulder is going to come back. The shoulder that's coming back, that hip is going to move forward and the opposite hip is going to move back. So these body axes are going to be moving like this throughout the sprint. If you see someone who's running and they look like they're just a brick and there's no undulation and oscillation of these body axes and there's no raising of their posture as they sprint, you're going to have some problems. Any excessive movement or lack of movement in these axes of the body is worth investigating, as there may be some compensation patterns or an injury situation that needs to be dealt with that is inhibiting the natural harmonious movement in these joint systems. A good point in the stride cycle to analyze posture is when the knees come together. This can give you a consistent point at which to analyze posture as the athlete accelerates, and will give you some idea of how the athlete is able to manage their body and their body orientation while moving through space. After taking a look at posture, then we move toward rhythm and frequency progression. Rhythm is defined as a strong, regular, repeated pattern of movement or sound. In sprinting, rhythm refers to the progression of frequency or pace at which someone moves as they accelerate. reach maximal velocity, and then minimize deceleration through the end of the race. Rhythm can be assessed visually or audibly by either watching the athlete's movements or listening to their ground contacts as they sprint, jump, do drills, etc. For most sprinters, issues with rhythm are going to be centered around overcooking their frequency too early, reaching maximum stride frequency too soon, or exhibiting an inconsistent rhythm and rhythmic progression throughout the sprint. Ultimately what we want to see is something like boom, 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 boom. A consistent progression toward a crescendo like we hear in music of going from a slower rhythm to a faster rhythm. We don't want to see right when the gun goes to go boom, 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 and then slow down and then try to pick it up again. We want to see slower to faster. Throughout a sprint, an athlete's rhythm should progress from slower to faster consistently throughout the acceleration. Athletes should aim to seek a smooth buildup of frequency as their posture rises and they progress down the track. Athletes who increase frequency too early or lack the progressive increase of frequency throughout the sprint will tend to reach maximal velocity too early and spend too much of the sprint decelerating. Having the highest stride rate frequencies in the first 20 to 30 meters of a sprint, that's going to distribute energy poorly, leaving you with nothing left for the back half of the race. In contrast, sprinters who manage their rhythmic progressions and stride frequency progression properly will be able to run the entire race better, as they'll spend less time decelerating and have more energy to distribute later in the sprint. Some research has shown that faster sprinters exhibit longer ground contact times during the first step as compared to slower sprinters, while also showing much shorter ground contact times later in the sprint. While some of this has to do with their force output characteristics, their force application characteristics, maybe their positioning in blocks, this also speaks to how the elite sprinter is a master of their rhythmic progression through the sprint, and they don't rush those first steps, and instead they use those first steps to produce a lot of force, to overcome inertia, and launch themselves through the air. We sprint fast when we master our ability to apply force, project through the air, reorient our limbs, and repeat the process. Since the early phases of the sprint require athletes to overcome inertia and create large projections with a lot of force, the earlier steps of the sprint will inherently be more force dependent and therefore take a little bit longer than the strides when we are approaching and at maximal velocity. So the big takeaway here is we want to have a progression from slower to faster rhythms or slower to faster frequencies. We want to raise our posture as we accelerate. We want to get increased stride length as we accelerate. All of these things will build through the sprint, not just go from 0 to 100 right when you step out of the blocks. J.B. Moran's study from 2011 states that force application technique is a determinant factor of field 100-meter sprint performance, which is not the case for the amount of total force subjects are able to apply into the ground. Put simply, the direction that you apply force to the ground is more important than smashing the ground with maximum force that is applied in a disadvantageous manner. Early in the sprint, forces are directed more horizontally, with this horizontal vector of force decreasing as the athlete's posture rises, their rhythm increases, and they eventually reach maximal velocity. Once maximal velocity is reached, net resultant horizontal forces are zero because the braking and propulsive forces have now equaled each other out. If you were still accelerating, you would have more propulsive forces than braking forces, so your net horizontal forces would be more than zero. But once you've reached maximal velocity and you've reached top speed, you are no longer able to produce horizontal force that is greater than the braking forces, which means resultant force in a horizontal direction will be zero, which means you're about to start decelerating. Once you're at this point, the athlete's job becomes focused on applying force vertically to ride the wave of momentum that was built up during acceleration, not trying to push backwards and reach forward. In my experience, it's more common to see athletes get caught up in trying to be too horizontal or front and back with their force applications in upright sprinting, over pushing behind them and overreaching in front of them. Instead of trying to reach in front and push behind themselves during the sprint, athletes should aim to attack the ground in line with the longitudinal axis of their body, aka they should be striking the ground vertically relative to their body. The athlete should always be producing force vertically relative to the long axis of the body, as this will help generate horizontal forces relative to the ground during acceleration when their body posture angle is angled forward, and produce vertical forces relative to the ground when their body posture is angled vertically in upright sprinting. This simplifies ground force application, as the athlete does not need to do anything different with their legs as they rise through acceleration. Instead, if your body's like this, apply force vertically in line with that longitudinal axis, not necessarily vertically relative to the ground. But as you rise, now applying vertical force once again relative to the longitudinal axis of the body will be producing vertical force. So just try to apply force in line with your body, and as you rise, you will get more vertical, and it'll allow you to be more vertical at top speed. When in doubt, cue the athlete to pick the foot up and set the foot down, rather than cueing them to push backward or reach forward. Only in cases where athletes show little horizontal projection and acceleration should they really be cued in a more horizontal manner. Next, we're going to move on to center of mass elevation. Just as the body's angle and posture should rise from horizontal to vertical during acceleration, the athlete's center of mass should also rise as they sprint. If the athlete changes their body angle but does not raise their center of mass as they do it, they'll end up either bounding or lunging their way down the track, exhibiting ground contacts that are too far in front and toe-offs that are too far behind the body. Projecting the center of mass upward each step will create space between the athlete and the ground and allow them to be able to reorient their limbs and strike the ground effectively, preparing for each step because they have the space to do so. Athletes who step side to side while sprinting during acceleration or any point thereafter are compensating for their center of mass being too low. As the body senses that there isn't enough space, it has to find space to avoid falling on its face. Side-to-side sprinting creates undue stress on the adductors and Achilles tendon and can set up athletes for groin, hip, or ankle injuries if left unaddressed. Next up, we've got limb symmetry. All athletes are going to exhibit asymmetries in their body movements, but generally speaking, sprinters need to show some symmetries between their limbs as they sprint. These symmetries can be from front to back side, such as between the front arm and the back leg. Similarly, we'll see symmetries between the front and back leg, as well as the front and back arm. For example, as the left leg reaches the thigh block position, where the thigh has reached, its highest height in the sprint stride cycle, and begins to reverse downward toward the ground, the right arm should move down at the same time. Actively swinging the arm downward in tandem with the leg can help contribute weak forces to the ground strike. When looking at the arms and legs, there are moments where we see that the angles of the forearm, the humerus, the thigh, or the shin will mimic one another. Significant deviations in angulation between the arms and legs can inhibit the stride pattern and lead to what looks like tense or poorly coordinated sprinting. At thigh block just after toe off, we can look for similar angles between the front shin, the front forearm, the back forearm, and the back thigh. The front thigh and the back humerus should block at the same time and with similar angles in order to allow for a smooth limb exchange throughout the stride cycle. We can look at the limbs relative to the torso as well. So for example, during acceleration, the shin angle at mid-stance should be similar to the angle of the torso. Significant deviations from this will make it hard to time and execute good quality projections off of the ground. Speaking of the ground, now we're going to talk about ground contact qualities. As stated previously, how we contact and interact with the ground is of fundamental importance to our ability to sprint. Athletes may contact too far out in front of the body, spend too much time on the ground, or they might cut their stride cycle too short and not spend enough time on the ground. Typically at ground contact during sprinting, we want to see the heel vertically aligned with the ilium or the front of the hip bone. As the hips pass over the foot and we reach mid-stance, most sprinters will exhibit a heel drop in a brief moment where they are flat-footed on the track. At the same time, the knee and the hips should bend slightly. This compression of the spring, so to speak, then gives the ability to the athlete to be able to launch and push off the ground, launching back up into the air for another stride. During upright sprinting, the athlete should focus either on applying force vertically with a downward leg movement or be cued to simply pick the foot up off the ground as soon as they feel it hit, letting the leg strike happen naturally. Cueing athletes in a horizontal or forward and backward manner in upright sprinting is not advisable for most athletes, as this can lead to excessive ground contact times, over pushing, and skew the athlete toward over rotating or exhibiting excessive backside mechanics. There may be some cases where the athletes need more antero-posterior cues or front-to-back cues, but these should be saved for special circumstances rather than being applied liberally to all athletes in all situations. Next up, we got flight and ground contact time progressions. So another area of focus when discussing sprint mechanics is the progression of flight times and ground contact times as the athletes accelerate to maximal velocity. Just like our rhythm should progress from slower to faster throughout the sprint, so should our ground contact times, as well as how much time we're spending in the air. Early in the sprint, ground contact times should be approximately twice as long as our flight times. Because we are overcoming inertia early in acceleration, ground contact times need to be long enough for us to produce horizontal propulsive impulses. As we build momentum and increase sprinting velocity, ground contact times will reduce and flight times will increase, such that somewhere around mid-acceleration, we should see close to a 1-to-1 ratio of ground contact to flight times. As we continue to accelerate into upright sprinting and top speed, flight times will overtake ground contact times, ending up with flight times somewhere around 1.6 times the duration of your ground contacts. So early in the sprint, we're spending, more time on the ground than we are in the air. In mid-acceleration, we're spending about the same amount of time on the ground as we are in the air. And closer to top speed and at top speed, we're spending more time in the air than we are on the ground. Our ability to progress our contact and flight times will depend on the factors previously discussed, such as our postural progression, our rhythmic progression, our vertical center of mass displacement or elevation produced by each stride, limb symmetries which allow for smooth movement, as well as the quality and orientation of our ground contacts. Now this last category we're going to cover injury and compensation patterns. This is not specifically, just to do with technique, but it does play a role in technique, and so we're going to discuss it here. One thing to consider when analyzing sprint technique is that old or current injuries can have an impact on how an athlete moves. These impacts may be clear, such as a hamstring injury inhibiting knee angulation, or they may be more subtle, such as a left shoulder injury leading to hip, knee, or ankle issues on the right side of the body. Once basic strength and mobility factors are accounted for in training, aberrant movements in sprinting should be looked at with some consideration for how an old injury could be manifesting in restricted or altered ranges of motion. Some of these patterns may be fixable and worth working on, but there are others that, there may be the case where the compensation pattern is better off left alone, and that's where the art of coaching really comes into play. It's important to watch video from the front, the back, the side, and even the top if you can get it, as these different angles are going to give you, different viewing angles of how the rotational qualities of the body are, or how the body's moving rotationally, how one limb is moving differently than another. And if all you ever do is look from the side or only look from the back, then you're not going to really see all that there is to see. So make sure you're viewing yourself or your athletes from different angles, so that way you can look for these different compensation patterns, restricted ranges of motion, and gain some insights into how they move and how they might be able to move better. Now in conclusion, sprint technique is something that all coaches and athletes should have some basic understanding of, and the ability for one to analyze sprint technique is a useful tool in the quest for faster sprinting speeds. Athletes and coaches should first pay attention to the postural and rhythmic progressions that sprinters exhibit as they accelerate, reach maximal velocity, and attempt to maintain speeds as they decelerate. Additionally, some attention should be paid to the vertical displacement of the center of mass, as this is going to allow for the athletes to get their limbs through, rotate into the next stride cycle, and be able to do that consistently as they accelerate. Once these core fundamentals are present, or at least are being worked on in some capacity, some focus can be given to the limb symmetries, the harmonic limb exchanges, and those types of qualities of the athlete, looking with a keen eye for situations where athletes are limited in their range of motion, either by coordinative factors or physical blockages that can be dealt with through treatment. It's important that athletes do not get caught up in overanalyzing their movement in practice, and coaches should be prudent to avoid over-cueing or over-coaching on the track. Some cues are useful, but it's far more easy to say too much and confuse the athlete than it is to give simple, effective instructions that have a beneficial effect. When in doubt, say less during the session and give more instruction after the session. Ultimately, all athletes can improve their sprinting technique, and by doing so, they can have a better shot at running faster and staying healthy. Seek incremental improvements over time and keep track of what works and what doesn't. With time, focus, and repetition, we can all see benefits in our sprinting that come as a result of improving our sprinting technique. So guys, thank you for watching this video. I hope you got something out of it. Hopefully you can take away some of these fundamental concepts in sprinting technique and use them to help analyzing your own technique or the technique of your own, the athletes that you coach. Like I said before, if you need help, if you need some extra eyes to look at your sprinting technique, make sure to head on over to sprintingworkouts.com or check the links below where you can sign up and, get some movement analysis done by me. There is a small fee, but for those who are struggling to analyze their own technique or just need an extra pair of eyes, that is a service I offer, so you can check that out. Anyways, that's all for now, guys, so I will catch you next time. This is Cody Bidlow with sprintingworkouts.com, signing off.